Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of the Archival Discourses. Tonight, I'm going to be looking at the topic of Lord Milner and national service. And for anybody who recently watched my stream I did with Semi-Agog on Carol Quigley's the Anglo-American establishment, where Lord Milner was a kind of an arch villain of that stream and a bit of history we were talking about. And I'm going to be delving into a issue that he was very passionate and almost completely obsessed with, which is getting Britain to adopt national service, which he was able to successfully do in 1916 during World War One. And I just think it's worth going through some of the speeches he gave in support of this and some of the thinking behind what he was trying to do. But before I delve into it properly, just a channel announcement. If people didn't see, I have launched channel membership. So if you want to support me, please join the channel. There's 3 tiers. There's the bottom one is Fella tier, which is 99p. You get like a membership badge. You'll get emojis as well, but I'll need to come up with some and add them. And then you also get membership polls. So if I get enough people join, I'll do membership polls to see what people might like me to create in future. Tier 2 is Orientalist tier. That's $2.99, same as Fella tier, but you also get member-only videos. So what I'm going to plan to do is, there's a few videos and streams I've done which have a lot of work has gone into. They're going to be paywalled from Saturday. So that's this Saturday, the 8th of February. So in terms of videos, the 3 I did on Friedrich List's The National System of Political Economy, they are definitely going to be paywalled. The Arnold Toynbee Study of History series I'm doing, and when that's finished, that'll also be paywalled as well. The final tier is called Pasha tier, after good old Glad Pasha. And so that one, you get the same as the first 2 tiers, but you also get access to member-only streams, because I'll also be putting a lot of streams I've done behind the paywall. I could definitely confirm that the Chatham House series I've done with Hunger, that will definitely be going behind the paywall, with the exception of the first episode. I'll leave that one free, so people can get a taste for the series. I will say that all of the audio recordings I did of the various essays, they will still stay free, by the way. And then I'll probably have a few other streams I've done as well go behind the paywall. So like there's a few I know they'd put a lot of work into, like the Alexander the Great one, I did the one on Antigonus Monophthalmus with Praise of Folly and Marcus, as well as the Scipio Africanus one I did with Praise of Folly as well. So if you want access to that in future, you need to become a member, or if you just want to support me. Furthermore, the Archival Discourses, this weekly show I do, this will stay free. I don't plan to put that behind the paywall. I'll say the majority of the content on the channel will still be free, so to speak. But just giving you that announcement. So if you want to support me, again, please join the channel and send super chats. So without further ado, let's bring up the speeches of Lord Milner. Right. Okay, so this is taken from a collection that's called The Nation and the Empire. And it's all the Milner speeches from 1897, when he's made a High Commissioner for South Africa, and they stop in 1913, just before World War One. And let's see if we can zoom in a bit for people watching. Okay, so first one, this is the first speech, House of Lords, the 10th of July 1906, titled The Cost of National Service. And there's a bit of a blurb. The following is a passage from a speech on Lord Roberts' motion to call attention to the unpreparedness of the nation for war and the necessity for action being taken in accordance with the recommendation of the Elgin Commission. That commission having declared that the true lesson of the war was that no military system could be considered satisfactory which did not contain powers of expansion outside the limit of the regular forces of the Crown, whatever that limit might be. And Iron Duke mentioned in his Discord earlier, where he shared this stream, that he did talk about Lord Roberts being one of the chief supporters of the implementation of national service. So Milner's sort of coming in here with the speech and propping up his colleague. So When we are considering the cost of such a system, do not let us forget that there are many ways of wasting money upon military preparations, waste to which a nation that has some uneasiness about its own military weakness is particularly liable. There's the waste of money involved in constant changes, in foolish, spasmodic expenditure, often followed by equally spasmodic and foolish retrenchment. If you add together all the losses in which the country has been involved by continually changing its military system, by its continual unpreparedness for war, losses which perhaps quadrupled and quintupled the cost of the last war in which we were engaged, I think it may be doubted whether a system of universal military training, however costly, would not, if only from the sense of security it would give us, make up for the sacrifices it would entail. I'm sure of this, that there is one form of military expenditure which in any case is not lost. I mean expenditure in developing the manhood of the nation. You get it back in vastly improved physique. One of the most serious problems, I believe, which faces this nation at the present moment is the development of certain qualities of discipline, order, method, precision, punctuality, and above all, in a great development of public spirit. The money which is spent in the physical and moral development of your men, you get back in peace as well as in war. At the risk of wearying your lordships, I would in conclusion quote, from among the massive quotations I could bring forward from competent and trained observers, what has been said with regard to the effect of the German military system, with all its faults, upon the progress of modern Germany, by a very able and careful inquirer, one who is especially distinguished by the total absence of any of that bias, which so often attaches to sociological experts against their own country. The following is a passage from a book on industrial efficiency by Dr. Shadwell. Under the German military system, the liability comes just when the lad has learned his trade, and undoubtedly forms a break in his civil career, but I have not met with two opinions about its educational value to the individual and its industrial value to the nation. Perhaps the most striking fact is the physical benefit derived from the exercises, the drill, gymnastics, and a regular life. It turns a weedy, anemic lad into a well-knit, upstanding man with sound organs and well-developed limbs. It further teaches him cleanliness, discipline, order, authority, self-respect, and respect for others. The effect in the workshop is visible at every turn. It is not too much to say that military service has been, in a great measure, the making of industrial Germany. That is the opinion of many men who have studied carefully the effect of the military system of continental nations, not so much from the point of view of their military strength as from that of their social organisation and industrial efficiency. For my own part, I venture, however, paradoxical it may seem, to express the conviction that the nations who, like the Germans, adhere to the principle of universal military training are perfectly right, and that in the long run, the peoples who are prepared to undergo the toil and face the danger of personal service will outstrip, not only in war, but also in the competition to peace, the peoples who shrink from it. So, very interesting and short speech from Milner here. So, it's interesting that he's talking about costs. So, he's contrasting the material expenditure of training all these men for war with, what he calls the moral cost. This is going to be good for them. It's going to make them good, disciplined men who we want in our society. And if you want my opinion, I think it's been quite disingenuous here because ultimately he doesn't really care, I think, necessarily about the quality of the British men. He just wants a load of white boys ready to go and die in whatever wars they want. And as we know, this would be implemented in World War One and helped contribute to the many hundreds of thousands of British casualties. But it is interesting that Milner gives a kind of, this deference to, I need to be paternalistic and show that I care about the subjects that are beneath me. Mm. And what I also find very fascinating is, to me, I see some very eerie parallels between Milner and a certain Tony Blair, because like Blair, who has an obsession with getting digital ID, and it's something he's tried to push for over the past 20 years or so. Lord Milner obviously pushed for national service for pretty much the point he left South Africa in 1905 up until it was implemented in 1916. So again, and as we'll see, he gave many speeches and just kept at it. So these are the kind of people that have ruled us. They just have these dogmatic managerial figures who, are like a dog with a bone with the horrible practices they want to implement. So, okay, they need to just get the next speech. So, The next one is 164. Okay. Just going to pull that up. Okay. Sorry, just loading. Okay. So Kensington Town Hall, March 15th, 1907, just titled National Service, and a meeting of the Kensington branch of the National Service League. So the National Service League is a public service organisation that Milner is actually in charge of, which is there to agitate for implementing national service. So I do not pretend to be a military expert. My adhesion to the principles of the National Service League is based on a very few simple considerations of a broad political and social order. I do not greatly care whether the Blue Water School or the critics of the Blue Water School get the best of the argument. The Blue Water School, for those who aren't aware, is a naval doctrine, if your navy operates the Blue Water School, that means that your navy can operate with strong operational effectiveness in any part of the globe, which the British Navy could have done back then. And I believe even by today's standards, the British Navy technically still meets the Blue Water School along with the French and the Americans. And it's interesting because what he's trying to do here is where he's trying to sell national service, he's trying to argue we need it for our national defence, or what if we get invaded? And the traditional British attitude was, well, that's what the Navy's for. We're an island. The Navy can stop any army from just landing and devastating the country. But let's keep reading and see his logic behind what he's arguing. Personally, I'm inclined to think that at the present time, at any rate, there is not much danger of an invasion of this country. I'm not such an alarmist as, what shall I say, the editor of the National Review, but it is really appalling to think that even a trifling invasion, even the landing of 10,000 or 5,000 men in this country, in our present state of military unpreparedness, would mean the panic which it would cause, the absolute confusion into which everything would be thrown, the disorganisation of credit, the dislocation of all industry, which might well result in causing a loss in a few weeks for transcending the cost of general military training for many years. Again, I think he's being melodramatic for a particular reason, because yes, 5,000 men is not insignificant, but I don't think that 5,000 men would be enough to completely disrupt the entire British economy. But a nation conscious of its power of defending itself could afford to treat such an invasion almost with contempt. My contention is that we cannot stake our existence upon the theory, for after all, it is nothing more than a theory, that invasion is absolutely and for all time impossible. One of the greatest military thinkers has said that there is nothing certain about war except that it will be full of surprises. Now, if it is impossible even for the greatest strategist to foresee the course of a particular war, how much more difficult, how hopeless must it be to attempt to forecast all the issues of an unknown future? No man can tell to what dangers we may be exposed 5 years hence, 10 years hence, but it stands to reason, as Mr. Max has said, that in the internal struggle for existence between nations, the nation which is trained to the use of arms must in the long run prevail over the nation which is not. The nation which returns to be trained must in the long run lose ground in the midst of trained nations. It has well been compared to an egg in a basket of stones. Shake the basket, and the stones may roll this way or that way, but the egg is sure to be broken. The fundamental principle of the National Service League is independent of particular prophecies. It is independent of the international position at any given date. It is of universal validity in the present condition of mankind. All that it maintains is that you must be far stronger and safer, less likely, much less likely to be attacked not only by weak peoples but by strong peoples, more certain if attacked to survive the crisis if you know how to fight than if you do not. We are told that in preaching this doctrine we take no account of the sea, of the immense power of the British Navy, but it is a complete error to suppose that the advocates of universal military training either ignore the supreme importance of the Navy or undervalue the greatness of that force of which we are all proud. The Navy has something else to do besides watching the shores of these islands. The Navy, in case of war, has got to strike with all its powers at the decisive point, which may be distant. We want to be able to say to our sailors, go where you are wanted, go, all of you, destroy the enemy's fleet. We landsmen can take care of that. While you are looking after your proper business, no invader shall set his foot on the shores of this country without having cause to regret it. And you see right here, he does a switch. He goes from saying, "Oh, we need universal military training for our defence," and people say the Navy is traditionally supposed to do that, and then he turns to saying, "Well, the Navy can then be used defensively," but then, well, hang on, Lord Milner. The whole point of this conversation is about national defence. why does the Navy need to be going off doing offensive operations if we're in a defensive war? The Navy can just defend our coastline. And again, I think he shows his hand a bit. There was another point. Granted that invasion is altogether and forever impossible, the fate of this empire may be decided without invasion. It may be decided on the mainland of Europe, almost within sight of our shores. It may be decided on the frontier of India or in other distant lands. How should we men of England feel if our small regular army were being overwhelmed on some distant frontier by a force of immensely superior numbers, and if hundreds of thousands of able-bodied men in this country had to look on in impotence, in spite of the fact that we have had more than enough transports to convey 20 divisions to their assistance? But again, here's the thing. He's now saying the army is going to be deployed overseas. Well, again, if the national service is supposed to be for a defensive war, why do the men have to be deployed overseas, Lord Milner? It begs the question now, doesn't it? And again, it's this idea that, oh no, our countrymen want to serve and they can't. And it's like, well, if they want to fight, they'll volunteer. Conscription is when you're compelling them to serve when they don't want to. So again, the logic defeats itself. Will the men of England be willing to go? Yes, thousands of them. The national spirit is not dead. The Boer War proved that. But would they be of use when they arrived? For want of previous training and organisation, many of them would not. The Boer War proved that also. You cannot improvise an army, and you must remember that the Boer War was small compared to the wars which we may have to wage. We are told that ours is a council of perfection, that we ask for something beyond the power and endurance of this nation, and that we cannot expect to maintain both a navy as great as the British Navy and an army as great as the German army. But who proposes that we should maintain an army like the German army? More than 400,000 perfectly trained soldiers always ready, and more than 1 million mobilizable in a few weeks. We should be content, and far more than content, if the military strength of this country stood in the same proportion to the military strength of Germany, as the German Navy stands to the British Navy. No one who knows the facts believes that this is at present the case. The naval needs of Germany are less than our naval needs. Our military needs are less than the military needs of Germany, though they are far greater, alas, than our present military capacity. We should have every reason to be satisfied if taking army and navy together, we compared favourably in defensive power with any of our rivals. Germany requires a great army always ready. What we require is a great, though not an equally great, reservoir of trained men upon which we could draw, though not so instantly or speedily. But we have got nothing of the kind, and that seems to be the view of the present War Minister. An excellent leaflet, indeed a whole series of pamphlets for the purpose of the National Service League, could be culled from the speeches of Mr. Haldane. Yes, Haldane was the Minister of War in the Liberal government of 1906 through to World War One. And what's also interesting is there's another speech we'll get to later where Milner is talking about a War Reform Act to reform the training of regiments. And Haldane will actually be one of the architects of the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force, that would be used in World War One. He recognises the necessity of a reservoir of men. He believes in the second line of national defence. He believes that it is the duty of every man to prepare himself to defend his country in case of need, and certainly as far as his proposed organisation of the second line of defence goes, Mr. Haldane appears to be in the main of the right lines. I speak with some reserve on this point because, as I have already said, I am not a military expert, and I am in the presence of some eminent military experts, but it does not appear to me that in 2 points at least, Mr. Haldane has hit on the true principle. In attempting to give us one force behind a regular army, instead of a number of competing overlapping forces, and in attempting to organise that second line of defence on some rational principle, that's for proper proportion of the different arms, with proper equipment, and with several parts subordinated to the whole. The plan that he proposes seems to be the skeleton of a real body. What we want is to clothe it with flesh and blood. What is wanting in his proposed system is, in the first place, that we are not by any means sure of getting the men to fill the cadres. In the next place, it also suffers from this trifling defect, that we are not going to give these men, even if we get them, any serious training until war actually breaks out. The enemy, to be sure, would not be so inconsiderate or so unchivalrous as to hustle us unduly while we were busy drilling. Is not this playing with the whole thing? Is not this inconsonant inconsistent with the root idea that it is the duty of every man to serve if need be the defence of his country. But that duty implies a corresponding right, the claim that every man has on the state, that it should enable him by proper training and by proper equipment to discharge that duty with efficiency. Both these essentials are lacking here. There is no obligation to serve, and there is no provision for training which would be really adequate. I think that we should be grateful. For my own part, I am grateful to Mr. Haldane for his ideas, but as a philosopher, he cannot objectively press him to be logical and to carry them to their inevitable conclusion. If it is the duty, and he says it is the duty of every able-bodied man, if need be, to defend his country, it cannot be a secondary or subordinate duty. If it is a duty at all, it is a very big duty. Why then object, and worse than object? Why denounce and hold up your hands in horror at the idea of that duty being enforced by law, and every other civic duty, including many minor ones, is enforced? Do not leave it optional to a man to pay taxes. It is the duty of the citizen to contribute according to his means to the cost of the state, and the law compels him to do it. If it is also his duty to contribute in his person to the defence of the state, why should not the law compel him to do that also? Why, in the name of common sense, is the one just and the other unjust, the one English and the other un-English, the one freedom and democratic government and the other tyranny and oppression? It's interesting what they try to justify in the name of democracy now, isn't it? And it's also interesting, this idea of contrasting national service with paying your taxes. Well, I think they are similar, because if you think about it, the more taxes we pay, the more the government piss up the wall on things like the DI and the NHS. So it's like with national service. If they have national service, they'll obviously be more warlike and belligerent because they've got the means to actually execute a war. So, yeah, take that, Lord Milner. Just got a comment here from Oswald. I wonder what the thoughts of the Army General Staff was at that time. From my understanding, Oswald, from a bit of other research I've done, the Army General Staff were generally not against reforming the recruitment of the army to make it better prepared after the troubles in the Boer War. However, a lot of them were opposed to the idea of implementing an actual national service. What was critical in actually getting it through was Milner and other members of his faction had to pull some schemes behind the scenes to try and get military men who agreed with them into positions of authority in the army in order to make sure their agenda was set ultimately. Okay. What is the use of talking? The majority of the people never will approve of such a system. Well, that remains to be seen. We stand here at any rate to declare our belief that you will never have real security, or what is almost as important, a sense of security, unless you have behind you a small regular army, a national militia, through which, with certain exceptions which every country recognises, your whole able-bodied youth are passed. We regard it as the completion of the education of the citizen. We hold that the state should have a claim on the service of the men so trained during the early years of their manhood, in case of national emergency, as to the existence of which Parliament should decide. Finally, we believe that if all those men in authority who realise our military weakness and the tremendous risks that it involves had the courage to speak out as Lord Roberts does, the people of this country would shoulder the burden if it be a burden and make the sacrifice if it be a sacrifice. Personally, I go further and believe that, though I may be exceptional in believing it, that what happens to be a sacrifice would turn out to be a blessing, even if we never fought another war, as we very likely we should never have to. The system we propose would be a blessing in peace as well as war. The last word I have to say to you is that, as the question of cost, the cost in money would no doubt be considerable, but I do not think that it would be enormous. I do not think that it would be as great as annual charge as the interest on the money wasted during the Boer War in consequence of our unpreparedness. I'm perfectly certain that it would not be equal to the interest on the money that would be wasted in the really great war in consequence of the same unpreparedness. But no doubt what people are afraid of is not so much the cost in money as what may be called the cost in kind, the hardship that it might cause, a healthy hardship. The inconvenience that might be involved, the loss of time to the individual citizen while it was taken away from productive labour. Yes, but there is something else. What if the sacrifice of time, which after all would be a very small percentage of a man's working life, is going to make him a better man during the rest of his working years, and very likely to prolong them? That is a point which you have to consider, and which especially the working men have to consider. Military training, in the vast majority of cases, tends to make a man physically better and morally tougher. It passes him through a school which, after all, has no equal for teaching discipline, endurance, manliness, order, comradeship, and patriotism. You talk of the loss of industrial efficiency. I believe that there would be a gain in industrial efficiency and a gain in other things too, a gain in the sense of common citizenship and the drawing together of classes by the performance of a common public duty, a gain in the increased feeling of dignity and responsibility which men would have who had actually done something for their country. I mean, you can get all those things without necessarily listing everybody in the army, Lord Milner. And I don't agree with you that it would lead to a loss of industrial efficiency. If you take all the men out of the labour pool and put them in the army, you then have to, employ women to make up that shortfall. And, as we know, women aren't as strong as men, and there's some things they can't do as efficiently. So I believe that if the nation had the military training, it would not be necessary for us to blush, as we sometimes have to blush now, because reverence for the flag, the emblem of national unity, is made an object of derision by members of parliament, even by ministers of the state, or because one of the noblest and most inspiring of human sentiments is described by the appropriate term of flag waving. I trust that the day will come when reverence for the flag will be as great among us as it is among the ancestors who won for us the high place which we still hold among the nations of the world. Okay, so that's the end of that one. So again, as you can see with the previous one, all the same points he's hitting on. We've got a duty to our citizens to enlist them in the army because it will make them, have a greater sense of like patriotism and like public duty. That's much better than even the cost that would be involved for us to do it. We risk our national defence, etc., etc. So. Okay, the next one is 188. So, okay. So this one is titled. So House of Lords, June 25th, 1907, the Territorial and Reserve Forces Bill. The Under-Secretary of State for War, Lord Portsmouth, in moving the second reading of this bill, ruled out compulsory service on the grounds of its expensiveness, its superfluousness, since in no circumstances would we require the services of the total number, amounting to about 400,000, reaching the age of military service in each year, its unpopularity, and because the chief military problem in our case is not defence of the United Kingdom so much as defence of the Empire, and a compulsory system will not help as much in this. Another difficulty on which the Speaker said that he need not dwell was that of harmonising such a system with the upkeep of an army for service abroad, which imperial necessities demand. Just got a comment from 999 Duke. At the time, Britain had by far the largest navy in the world. Britain could not afford a huge army too. Yes, exactly, Iron Duke. But unfortunately, as I've said earlier, Lord Milner, I believe, is being very disingenuous here because he and his buddies are planning a European war, and he wants the tools in order to do it, which is why he's obsessively pushing this. My lords, like the noble lords who has just addressed you, I approach this question purely as a civilian. I approach it with the reluctance in an assembly containing so many men, distinguished both by their achievements and by their knowledge of matters military, but perhaps I have had rather closer touch with the realities of war than many civilians. I've stood on the brink of and then looked into the black abyss of national disaster, and the lessons which that experience taught me I shall carry with me to the grave. I've seen this country with its 40 million of people, and the empire behind it was some 120 million or 150 million, more of the same race, engaged in a struggle with a small people about 1/100th of their number and on the brink of defeat. And what made that experience bitterest of all was the thought that it was wholly unnecessary, that this country had immense resources in men, brave, patriotic and willing, and yet at the critical moment it could only muster a sufficient number to pull through. That experience impressed upon me for my lifetime the fact that you cannot improvise soldiers, and that no amount of patriotism, willingness, or devotion will save a military untrained nation from disaster in any great struggle. I should have hesitated to have addressed your lordships tonight, but for two reasons. One is that those who agree with me on the question of compulsory service, I fear we are but a small number in this House, but we are a growing body in the nation, have been directly challenged by the noble Earl, the Under-Secretary of State for War. I do not know why he directed so much attention to this puny body of adversaries, unless it was that he felt a little happier in dealing with those generalities. with which it is possible to attack the position of the advocates of compulsory service, than of dealing with some of the details of the complicated scheme which he was expounding. Be that as it may, I feel bound to say a few words in reply to some of the points which he raised against us, but there was another reason, that is that I have been asked and pressed to speak by the noble and gallant Earl Lord Roberts, who is my leader on this question. I recognise him as my captain and obey his orders, though I sincerely wish he had a more able lieutenant. I will do this at the bidding of the noble Earl, not only because I recollect the day when he came out to South Africa and turned disaster into victory, which alone would have entitled him to my willing obedience in all questions of this kind, but because, if I may say so without disrespect, I feel when listening to the noble and gallant Earl on the subject that I am breathing a different atmosphere from that which prevails when even the ablest and most experienced of those distinguished statesmen who have to deal with the military questions in the country are addressing us. It seems to me that the noble Earl keeps continually before him and is always pressing towards two vital points, our requirements and our capacities, which are the only 2 points which, in my opinion, profoundly matter, whereas all others who deal with this question, however great the ability and experience which they bring to bear upon it, never get beyond certain given conditions which have no foundations in the nature and essence of things and are more or less accidental. I mean, the existing objection on the part of perhaps the majority, at any rate of large classes, of the people to citizen service, and the idea of a given number of millions, which we have drifted into regarding as a sort of generally admitted figure round which our military expenditure is bound to revolve. When I consider how different has been the experience of many of us, our most distinguished statesmen, at the War Office from their experience anywhere else, when I see one man after another, who in every other public office or public duty which he has filled or discharged has achieved great distinction, attempting in succession the task of reforming our military system, and not one emerging from the ordeal with increased credit, I do not believe for a moment that it can be the fault of those distinguished men. Why should they always be less successful as Secretaries of State for War than in any other capacity? The fault lies in the fact that we are trying to deal with this question on an impossible basis, and we shall continue to fail as long as we try to deal with it on that basis. Given the necessities of the British Empire, given the vast responsibility for defence which it imposes upon us, I'm firmly convinced that you cannot produce any satisfactory military scheme if you're going to be bound by the too rigid limits of volunteer service and an expenditure of something like £28 million of money. I mean, that is a hell of a lot of money, even for 1907. So, yeah, I think there's very good concerns over the cost of this. Okay. We shall go on from failure to failure unless we recognise that fundamental condition of things. Do we approach the question of our naval defence in this spirit? Attention has been called tonight to the fact that naval estimates at one time circled around 10 or 11 millions, and that they have become 36 million, reduced now, I believe, to 30 million. Why was it that the nation, which at that one time would not agree to spend more than 11 million on the navy, accepted and accepts with readiness to this much larger sum? Because the navy is critical for the imperial defence more so than a huge army. Because the question of naval defence has once for all been put upon an intelligible basis, because it has been approached from the point of view of a reasoned and thought out consideration of our requirements. Nothing of the kind is ever attempted, at any rate officially. In connection with the requirements for the defence of the empire on land, if we were to approach the matter from the point of view of our requirements, I do not believe that it would involve so enormous an increase of expenditure, although I have always admitted that some increase would be necessary. We should, however, find that it demanded a number of men which we can never hope to get on the present basis. Only numbers far larger than we are contemplated by Mr. Haldane's expeditionary force, and far larger than any British statesman had ever dared face, would really suffice to defend this state and empire in contingencies which are far from improbable. It is because the noble and gallant Field Marshal continually and courageously strives to make his countrymen realise these facts, and deals with the subject on the fundamental ground of what is really necessary for the defence of the empire, instead of forever arguing upon certain given, more or less accidental data which have been conventionally accepted by both parties in politics. It is for this reason that he appeals on this question to his countrymen, and I believe no other statesman of today appeals, and is producing an effect upon public opinion, of the extent of which political leaders are present very little aware. I wish to be as brief as possible, but I should like to reply shortly to some of the arguments and addressed to us by the noble Earl who moved the second reading of this bill. I'm not sure that I shall cover the ground of all his objections, but I will deal with the most important. One objection which he took, and it is a common one, was that any system of universal military training and service, such as advocated by the National Service League, which were the leader of Lord Milner, would provide us with a much larger army than we need for home defence, and would not provide what, after all, we most need, namely the power of expansion for our expeditionary army in case of a serious war abroad. I think that is a fair statement of one of the noble Earl's arguments, but that is an argument which comes strangely from the noble Earl, representing us as he does in this House as Secretary of State, who has dwelt with emphasis over and over again and has defended his whole plan principally on the grounds of the importance of having such a force in this country as would enable us greatly to expand our army abroad in the event of any really serious danger to the Empire. That's the whole justification of the nation in arms, for which the Secretary of State has made such eloquent appeals. Let me say how this question strikes me. I consider that we are killing two birds with one stone. I do not believe that we are so safe in this country either from raids or from serious invasion as some noble lords assume. Well, if you believe that, Lord Milner, why are you so aggressively pushing national service? I believe there is a great deal of the best military opinion on my side, and as long as there is any serious military opinion in favour of the possibility, not only of a raid, but of a really dangerous invasion, I, for my part, decline to have anything to do with running the fearful risk of being as unprepared to meet it as we are today. Against any serious invasion, we require numbers such as the system we advocate alone would give, but there is a great deal more in it than that. The existence of a large body of really trained men in this country would give a freedom to our regular army which it does not at present possess, because a certain number under present circumstances will always be retained here. For most important of all, it would give to our fleet a freedom of action which would at least double its effective usefulness in time of war. There is nothing more serious in our present state of military unpreparedness at home than the cramping effect which it would have on the action of our fleet. The first principle of naval strategy, whether we belong to the Blue Water School or not, is that the fleet should be free to go and seek out the enemy's fleet and destroy it. Can anyone who knows the state of public opinion in this country realise what the effect of the absence of the fleet from these shores with an enemy possibly threatening them would be? Can anybody believe that the boldest Secretary of State would venture to send the fleet where he ought to send it in case of a war with any great power? As long as we had not such an army, or at any rate such an armed force in this country, as would put any danger or invasion out of the question, the existence of a trained nation here would, in the first place, give far greater effectiveness to our regular army, but it would also give far greater effectiveness to our fleet. But no doubt the greatest point of all is that if we had here a trained nation, if we had what the Secretary of State has asked for, namely a large reserve of men trained to arms, we should be able to send out in case of a great emergency a large number of volunteers who would be effective soldiers from the first moment they took part in the campaign. The risk which we run today, the weakness which afflicted us so greatly in the South African War, and the weakness which may destroy us in the case of a great war, is that there is no amount of military training and knowledge on the part of the nation at all proportionate to the amount of bravery and patriotism which its citizens undoubtedly possess. Undoubtedly, the strongest of all arguments for the general military training of the people is the fact that it would put this nation into a position effectively to defend any portion of the empire if it was convinced of the rightness of the war in which it was engaged. Tomorrow, you might be engaged in a struggle in which there were not, as there unfortunately were in the case of the South African War, the differences of opinion among us, a struggle in which we were all convinced of the righteousness of our cause, a struggle upon which the very life of our empire depended and in which we might require 500,000 men. We have got the 500,000 men, but how many of them would be out of any use in the field if they were to volunteer and go out? Well, they're still soldiers, Lord Milner. It doesn't make a difference if they're conscripted or not. If they're ready and available because they volunteer to, then that's fine. The two vital points of the whole discussion are our possible requirements and our actual capacities. The contention of those who are led by the noble and gallant Field Marshal was that it is the business of our statesmen to see that every potential military capacity of the country is developed to such an extent as will enable us to provide for our possible requirements. Then one word in conclusion as to the alleged moral superiority of the voluntary principle. We are told that a smaller number of men giving their services freely are better worth having than a larger number acting under compulsion. What I object to is the present system is the premium which it sets upon a man not doing his duty in the matter of personal service for the defence of his country. If we even held the balance fairly between those who undertake this duty and those who do not, there would be something to be said for it. but our present system inevitably throws the whole weight of our habits and social arrangements into the scale against the men who undertake this duty and favours the men who shirk it, so that the whole weight of the system leans against the volunteer. But I, for my part, am totally unable to understand how it can be contented, on the one hand, that the training of a man to fit himself to take part in the defence of the country and empire is a duty, and on the other hand, that it is an injury to the man to insist on his performing that duty. I cannot see the difference between the principle and the principle of taxation. You might just as well contend that, though it was the duty of a man to contribute with his purse to the defence of the country, yet it was unjustifiable to make that contribution a legal obligation upon him. The two things seem to me to rest upon absolutely the same basis of principle, and I am thoroughly convinced that if you're really going to attempt what I believe this bill honestly desires to do, namely to obtain a citizen army of adequate dimensions, you will never be successful so long as you are not in a position to lay down some general rule with regard to it, which all citizens have to conform. Again, going back to this whole tax idea again. On the very threshold of your efforts, you are met by the objection of the employers. We are told that no doubt it would be better if these people trained for a fortnight or 3 weeks, but that it cannot be done because employers are willing to let them go for a week, but not for a fortnight. The whole national attitude of mind which makes such an argument possible is wrong. If this is a thing which is for the good of the nation as a whole, the question of the convenience of employers cannot be allowed to stand in the way. Yet it will stand in the way, and difficulties of this character will forever defeat you until you have laid down one general simple rule for every able-bodied man with regard to service in the army, and then, in this country, as in other more logical countries, such difficulties will be swept away. Okay. Yeah, the next one, I believe, is a fair amount shorter. I think it's about 2 pages, I believe. That's 287. Hang on. Okay, here we go. Comment from Iron Duke. It was against all British military decision to raise a huge mass conscript army. Yep, absolutely. Don't disagree with you there, Iron Duke. Yeah, so this was Weybridge, 22nd of May, 1908. National Service and the Law, from a speech delivered at a meeting of the County of Surrey branch of the National Service League. So again, another one where he's addressing the members of the of this pressure group for national service. The objects of the League are twofold. First, to induce the people of this country to accept the principle that every able-bodied man of military age who is fit is bound to be ready to take part in the defence of his country. And secondly, in order to give practical effect to that principle, the law should provide for the military training of all our youths, with certain definite and well-recognised exceptions. These, however, should really be exceptional cases. The general rule should be military training equally for men of all classes enforced by law. This enforcement by law is what a great many people stick at. They say, we agree with you that it is the duty of every able-bodied man, in case of need, to take part in the defence of his country. We should be glad if they would all enlist in the territorial army, but the idea of compelling them to do it is contrary to our conception of the freedom which is so characteristic of our British race, and besides, is not a volunteer with half a dozen men who are compelled to do a thing. This is the difficulty I want to face. I do not attempt to blink to the fact that the programme of the National Service League cannot be carried out without compulsion. But is compulsion necessarily so odious? The compulsion would come from law, made by the chosen representatives of the majority of the people of the country. It follows, therefore, that at least the majority of the people would be compelling themselves. It is impossible to conceive such a great change being introduced except with an overwhelming force of public opinion behind it. It may be said, if the majority of the people are willing, what needs have you for compelling law? That is just where a great mistake is made. A national army is not going to create itself, however willing even the majority of the people may be. There must be organisation, there must be a carefully worked out system, and law alone can ensure that cooperation which is obviously essential to a great national system. Even a volunteer army is subject to discipline and compulsion at every turn. Therefore, the whole question is whether people are to be expected themselves to take the initiative in submitting to compulsion, or whether it is to be applied to every fit person without such individual initiative. Assuming it to be the deliberate conviction of the majority of the people of this country that military training should be general, what is the objection to making every man go up for training at a certain age? The law would merely be telling them how and when to do that, which the majority were perfectly willing to do. Granted that a minority are unwilling or perhaps only reluctant, not keen enough themselves to take the initiative, are we to be content that the whole thing should be ruined and the safety of this country jeopardised because of the existence of that minority of laggards? I can understand a man saying that a national army is not necessary, but I cannot understand his agreeing that it is necessary and yet leaving it to the individual caprice or convenience to decide whether we should get it or not. People are compelled by law to be educated, to keep their houses in a certain state of sanitary repair, to drive on one side of the road, to do 101 things every day of their lives. In all these respects, the majority coerce the minority, sometimes for trivial, sometimes for doubtful objects. But there is one object in respect of which it is the terrible and unspeakable thing to have such coercion, and that's precisely the supreme object of all, the defence of our country, of our lives and property, of all that is dear to us. With regard to this object alone, will the majority is to be impotent? No, I contend that a general system invoking the cooperation of all citizens is not merely the only way of ensuring a national army, but the only fair way of obtaining it, and it is just the fairness which, I believe, when the thing is properly understood, will make it generally acceptable. The average citizen, though the idea may at first be distasteful to him, will be perfectly willing to undergo military training if he is brought to recognise the necessity of it, and if his neighbours have got to undergo it too. And one thing I will just say to this is that, okay, he's right that most of those things he listed there are required by law, but those are things that you have to do every day to maintain like a functional society that doesn't go to crap. You don't need like a national service to ensure the basic functioning of everyday life. You need it if you've got, globalist wars you want to you soldiers for. Right. Okay. Just bringing the next one up. So the next two are a bit longer. They're both about 9 pages. Okay. Page 365. So okay. This one, Nottingham, April 19th, 1909. National Peril and National Service. From a speech delivered at a meeting of the Notts Liberal Unionist Association. So the Liberal Unionists were a breakaway faction of the Liberal Party that worked with the Tories. They'd eventually merge into the Tory Party. I believe it was only a couple of years later in 1912. And they're a party Milner was very much affiliated with because he was originally appointed High Commissioner for South Africa by the Liberal Unionist MP Joseph Chamberlain, the former Colonial Secretary. I've not been kept awake by An Englishman's Home, much as I agree with what appear to be the opinions of the author. My flesh does not creep at the sight of a German waiter. I have no reason to suppose that Germany is deliberately mediating an attack upon us, but then I don't need an indefinite shock to make me uneasy. My feeling is not one of habitual security, varied by occasional fright. It is of chronic, but as I think, reasonable anxiety. I cannot tell at what time. I do not know in what quarter a grave danger may arise to the empire. I doubt whether any man can. All that I know is that if we continue year after year and decade after decade to run such tremendous risks, to undertake such heavy obligations express or moral without knowing how we shall discharge them, to conduct so vast a business with such an inadequate insurance, we are bound sooner or later to come to grief. I thought the Boer War had taught us that, but the Boer War is apparently forgotten. Some improvements have resulted from it, no doubt, notably in the training of our regular army. Though the numbers of that army, as you will remember, have been materially reduced, but in the main we are going on the old lines, as if we had no warning that we are living on the edge of a precipice. And what makes that state of things more bitter is the conviction that it is totally unnecessary. Humanly speaking, it should be possible for us to enjoy a position of great security, and one in which scares like the present would be wholly unreasonable. The potential strength of this empire is immense, but so is also its unreadiness and lack of organisation, and no mere expenditure of money will put things right. More expenditure of money may indeed be necessary, but there may also be a great waste of money from want of system, and nothing can be done in a hurry. What we need is carefully to think out our requirements as a whole and then to set about year after year working up to the accepted standard. If that were to be the result of the present scare, we should have reason to congratulate ourselves on its occurrence, but so far it is difficult to see many signs of a comprehensive grasp of the situation on the part of our rulers. I fully realise the embarrassment of a government which has to keep on apologising to its supporters for having any armaments at all, and I readily admit that the ministry contains men who are thoroughly serious about maintaining our present predominance at sea, and that these men, for the time being at any rate, have got the upper hand. Undoubtedly, the prospects of our keeping up an adequate navy are brighter for all that has recently happened. And that is a great deal to the good, provided that we do not concentrate our attention upon one particular item because it happens to be fashionable to have caught on to the neglect of other considerations. We want our fleet as a whole to be the best in the world, not only material and men, but in respect of the strategy and forethought applied to the disposition and the use of it. But there's something more than that. You must not look only at the Navy as a whole, but at national defence as a whole. National defence is not merely a question of fleets, though to a country like ours, an island country with great overseas possessions and a great foreign trade, its fleet must always be of primary importance. It is not only a question of sea power, it may very well be in some degree a question of air power. It always must be, to a great extent, a question of land power. All these things have to be considered together. You may build battleship after battleship, you may go piling Pelion upon Ossa in the way of naval expenditure, but you'll never have a satisfactory or well-balanced system of defence until behind your small professional army, the whole of which may be wanted thousands of miles away and need to be reinforced when there, as was the case in the South African War, you have a force capable of taking charge of these islands and of sending help, if necessary, to the men at the front. In other words, you must make your territorial army a reality, something like equal in respect of numbers and training to the work which it may at any time be called upon to perform, and I, for my part, have never concealed my conviction that you will not achieve that result on what is known as the voluntary system. If it is really the duty of every able-bodied man of military age to take his share in the defence of his country, as we keep on asseverating, why should he not be called upon to discharge it like any other recognised civic duty? Those who are prepared to leave the constitution of an adequate second-line army to chance cannot really believe in its necessity. One argument, and to my mind, it is the only formidable argument which is brought against those who, like myself, advocate national service, is that it would cost money, though the amount that it would cost has been grossly exaggerated. Well, in a previous speech, Lord Milner, you admitted that, what was it, like something like £40 million wouldn't be sufficient, which does seem an extreme, extraordinary amount of money, more than the Navy was even costing. So, I don't really think it's been exaggerated. But do those who use that argument consider how greatly the efficiency of the Navy itself would be increased by the fact of having a nation behind it which was capable of self-defense on shore? You may strengthen the Navy by increasing its size, but you may also strengthen it, may give an increased value to whatever numbers of ships and sailors you have, by relieving them of part of the work of national defence and setting them free to deal more effectively with the rest. No doubt the existence of a powerful navy is and always will be our greatest safeguard against invasion. But invasion ought to be an unprofitable business in any case. The men of this country who are not sailors ought surely to be in a position to give a good account of any invader and see the navy to strike wherever it can strike most effectually, without the restrictions which the sense of our defencelessness at home would, under present circumstances, be certain to impose on its mobility. Besides, there are things which a navy, for its priority and importance, cannot do. It is on land that the fate of empires is in the last resort decided, and we cannot overlook the possibility of being called upon to make efforts on land, which will require larger numbers than anything short of national service can give us. I know that people are getting rather into the habit nowadays of saying that in view of the growth of other nations, of the general increase of armaments, and of the development of a new spirit of restlessness in parts of our own empire, it will soon be more than we can do to maintain our old position, that the weary Titan is no longer equal to the burden, and so forth. But just think of the vast reserve of power that we possess if only we choose to use it in the young manhood of this country, which we alone among great European nations will still leave wholly or almost wholly untrained to arms. With all that latent strength not drawn upon, how can it be said with sincerity that we are at the end of our tether? Let us be honest with ourselves. We may be unwilling to make the effort. We may not think the object of national greatness and security worth the trouble of maintaining it. We may hold that it is wicked and unchristian to keep up, and not indeed an army, but an adequate one. That seems to be the sincere, if somewhat strange, opinion of a good many worthy people. But do not let us say that we are unable to keep up an adequate army, or that we cannot afford it. The money cost in this case is not the chief cost, nor would it in the sum total of our national expenditure. be a very great item. The chief cost is that of the personal service, which it is the fashion to describe as a sacrifice, but which, kept within reasonable limits, is not a sacrifice but a blessing, especially for a population living in the conditions in which the majority of the British people live today. It would supply just that physical toughening and discipline which, combined with an improved system of popular education, is what we most require alike from the point of view of health, of morals, and of industrial efficiency. But that does not exhaust the list of our undeveloped reserves of strength. One of our fellow citizens across the seas, the events of the last few weeks have once more brought home to us the great and, in the long run, almost incalculable possibilities which arise from the fact of their devotion to our common heritage and traditions. It would in any case be a misfortune to have to leave them out in any comprehensive scheme of imperial defence. So not only do we need to conscript the British into this, we need to conscript the Australians, the Canadians as well. I mean, is there no limit to this like great horde you wish to assemble, Lord Milner? It is impossible to leave them out when they themselves came forward and claimed to be included in it. This is not the first time that they have given practical proof of their sense of the solidarity of the Empire. We had very substantial proofs of it during the South African War, but there is this new element in the present case, and it is an element of supreme importance, that this is not merely an impulse to give help in a particular emergency. The dominant idea of the Dominions, if I interpret it all right, is to prepare themselves to fill a permanent place and undertake definite responsibilities. In the general scheme, it is an idea which has germinated in their own minds, but they are looking to us for guidance and counsel in carrying out, and there we are bound to give. It is a great opportunity, but we must not expect too much to come of it at first, or underrate the intricacies of the problem. The question is how to direct the previous precious spirit of imperial cooperation into the right channels. And the true principle, I cannot doubt, is to encourage each dominion to provide in the first place for the defence of its own soil and its own shores, and of all imperial interests there or whereabouts, by its own native forces. There's the first thing, local self-dependence. After that, and springing out of that, mutual help. There may appear at first sight to be great waste of power in the multiplication of separate defensive forces, but in the first place, there is inherent in the present constitution of the Empire, and in the next place, it will lead to the maximum of collective strength in the end. Mere contributions from the Dominions to the British Army or Navy, valuable as they are under existing conditions, invaluable as they are as an evidence and expression of imperial patriotism, will never take us very far. It is a real imperial army and navy constituted by the combination of the forces of the several self-governing states. Forces organised from the outset on the common pattern and controlled ultimately, as I hope, by common authority. There's the goal towards which we should continuously strive. And now I must apologise to you for having dealt thus hastily, superficially if you will, with a subject of such vast importance and complexity. I cannot tax your patience by any further treatment of it tonight, even if I had the presumption, which I have not, to speaking dogmatically on the matter. We are only at the beginning, as I hope and believe, of a new great chapter of imperial development, but let me point out to you in conclusion how intimately it is connected with the question which occupies so great a space in our local politics today. The root idea of the great movement initiated to his internal honour by Mr. Chamberlain, the movement for fiscal reform, is to strengthen the foundations of the British Empire. And throughout the rest of this speech, he's ultimately talking about tariffs and imperial preference as the policy outlined there by Joseph Chamberlain, the former colonial secretary. I mean, that's actually something I do agree with Chamberlain and Milner on, is the need for imperial preference and tariffs, but that's a little bit beyond the scope of this stream today, so I'm going to stop that essay there. There was one final one I want to read. Okay. Page 469. This is the last one I'm going to read tonight. So, okay. Canterbury, October 28th, 1910. National Service, National Security. At a meeting of the Canterbury branch of the National Service League, the Dean of Canterbury presiding. So as you can see, there's free speeches where he's just going around the country and just drumming up support for this campaign to implement conscription. A good deal of time is often spent at meetings like the present in insisting on the duty of every able-bodied man of military age to fight for the defence of his country in case of necessity, and therefore to undergo the training which is requisite to qualify him to fight efficiently. and I do not for the one moment say that such assistance is idle or superfluous. But on this occasion, just by way of a change, I'm not going to argue about this duty. I'm going to assume that you recognise it. In my opinion, the great difficulty before the National Service League is not that of persuading people in the abstract of the duty of defending their country. The great difficulty is that of convincing them of the practical necessity, or rather, let me say, the practical utility of universal military training for that purpose. Let me put the argument, the only formidable argument, as it seems to me, which is ever brought against us. That argument, I will state, is very broadly, but, I hope, quite fairly in this. Our country consists of islands, and of islands which, in respect of their food supply, are not self-supporting. It therefore depends for its security, you may say, for its existence in case of war, upon the command of the sea. As long as our navy is supreme at sea, the invasion, or at least invasion in great force, is impossible. Therefore, there is no occasion to have a large army to repel it. If, on the other hand, our navy lost the command of the sea, then no degree of military strength would be of any avail, for we could be starved into submission. Yes, but the British Navy at the time had to be double the size of the next two combined, so the Germans and the Americans. So Britain was the naval superpower of the world. So the idea of any country being able to invade us and visiting us at sea is ridiculous, especially in our home waters. As we've seen in World War One, okay, the Germans did shell Scarborough and one or two other towns, but that was the extent of their attack, other than bombing with Zeppelins. By far, the most damaging of all the criticisms directed against those who urge the necessity of a great increase of our military strength is that the efforts may have an injurious effect upon the strength of the Navy. There is, after all, a limit, it may be said, and truly said, to what we can do, to what any nation can do, however great its population and resources, in the way of preparation for war. If you're going in for a great increase of your military armaments, it must inevitably, in the long run, tend to diminish the extent of your naval armaments, and you will have developed the less essential of your defensive forces at the expense of the more essential. I will admit at once that, if I believe that the demand for a greatly increased army and for the adoption of the principle of universal military training and service as the only means of getting it was going to result in reducing our strength at sea, I should never raise my voice in support of that demand. But I do not believe that it will have any such effect, but just the reverse. Let me try and explain to you why I think so, for that is the best way I know of unfolding the whole of our policy and answering as far as I can the argument which I have just put against myself, and which I repeat is the most formidable argument we have to face. Undoubtedly, the problem of national defence must be looked at as a whole. It is not the strength of the army by itself which is the vital point, nor yet the strength of the navy by itself, but their strength in conjunction. You may say that it's a platitude, a truism, the most obvious thing in the world, yet in practice it is, like other truisms, often not sufficiently regarded. It is not sufficiently regarded, as it seems to me, by those who urge that argument which I have just propounded. They seem to think that an increase in the strength of our army would have no effect on our navy, except indeed the possible bad effect of indirectly weakening it by dissipation of our resources. But that is surely a fundamental fallacy. You may strengthen your navy directly by adding to the number of your ships and your guns, but you may also strengthen it indirectly by relieving it of some of the burdens which, at present, it has to carry. If it is true, as I think, I can show you that we at present look to our naval forces to do work which is more properly the business of a land force, then by transferring that work to a land force, we should be increasing the capacity of the navy to discharge its own proper duties. The whole problem is looking at, as I have said, at national defence as a whole to determine in what proportion you should develop the one or the other side of it. No doubt the proper proportion will vary with the circumstances of each case. It will be different in the case of an island state and in the case of a state which has land frontiers as well as a seaboard. I mean, okay, there are land frontiers in the colonies and overseas, but the home of Britain, the British Isles, are islands. So again, he's just being completely disingenuous. But in every case, there must be a certain proportion. Sooner or later, you will reach a point at which, however much you may have developed one of your fighting arms, you must, in the interest of your total strength, and even in the interest of that highly developed arm itself, look also to the development of the other. Nobody in his senses, however great the importance he assigns to the Navy, would contend that we could do altogether without an army. And the question at any given time is whether, in the interest of the national defence as a whole, it is the army or the navy, or both, which more requires strengthening, and if both, in what several degrees. There are many people who maintain today that our navy, powerful, and as it is still not powerful enough. I am not prepared to dispute it, but I do maintain that, however urgent may be the necessity of strengthening our fleets, the necessity of strengthening our land forces is at least equally urgent. And as it is so, not only for the sake of our security on land, but quite as much for the sake of our power at sea, granted as I, for one, am most amply prepared to grant, that sea power is vital for this country and empire, I yet hold that for the maintenance of that sea power itself we require a more considerable degree of land power than we have at present got, that we shall continue to run unconscionable risks until we provide it. This is not, I think, the generally accepted view. Certainly, it does not seem to be the official view. The official view, as far as it is possible to elicit it, would appear to be this: we an army, but not on the scale of the armies of continental states, not even of small states such as Bulgaria and Romania. For our army exists not for wars such as those in which continental armies may be called upon to engage, but for the defence of our overseas possessions and, of course, principally of India. For that purpose, our regular army in its present numbers is sufficient, having regard to the extent to which it can be increased in case of emergency, by the reserve and special reserve. Now that by itself is a very questionable proposition. With our experiences in the Boer War before us, it takes a bold man to assert that, even if we disregard altogether contingencies nearer home, our regular army with its present strength and its present degree of expansiveness is certain to be adequate to any demands which may be made upon it with respect to our overseas possessions. It did not prove adequate in the case of the Boer War. We had to supplement it with all its reserves and the militia by a number of troops hastily extemporized for the occasion at enormous cost, and with very varying results in point of efficiency. But our regular army is no larger now than it was then. It has even been somewhat reduced. Neither, I think, can it be maintained than its power or expansion is greater for the special reserve, the only new feature no more than replaces, if it does indeed replace, the old militia. And then you must remember that the demands of the Boer War left this country practically denuded of regular troops. Is that a position of affairs, the recurrence of which we can contemplate with equanimity? Are we content with an army, the whole of which, and indeed more than the whole of which, may be required in some part of our vast and scattered empire, leaving us without any regular troops at all in these islands? What is the official answer to that question? Well, the official answer, Lord Milner, is when you wage a war against a people, a total war where you want their complete annexation and submission, you're going to make them fight with every last breath, which then means you then have to deploy much more men than you usually would in order to prosecute that war. So maybe if you don't commit to total war, you don't have to commit all your resources to such a project. Well, I'm bound to say the official answer is far from clear, but this at least is as clear as noonday. There is no escape from this dilemma that you must either say that the whole of our regular army and its reserves is more than can possibly be required to the defence of our distant possessions, an assertion which, in a view of our quite recent experience in South Africa, is patently absurd, or you must admit that our present arrangements leave us perpetually liable to be deprived of the whole of the regular army and its reserves for the purpose of home defence, and yet it must be obvious to everyone who thinks seriously of these matters that if there is any danger, and who will maintain that there is none, of our being involved in a life and death struggle at or near home, it is precisely in a crisis in which our regular army was required in some distant region that their danger would be the most likely to arise. We were certainly very near it at the time of the Boer War, although we had then what we have since lost, an overwhelming preponderance at sea. And yet it is upon our strength at sea, relatively diminished as it is, that the official Pangloss always falls back when he is driven into this corner. Our regular army with its reserves may be wanted in the most distant parts of the earth. The whole of it may be so wanted as it was less than 10 years ago, but what does it matter? We shall still be safe over here, for we have always got the Navy. The Navy is our true and our sufficient home defence force. But if that is so, why have a territorial army at all? Why make all these frantic appeals to the patriotism of the nation to supply us with what, on this theory, is a superfluous luxury? The official answer to that conundrum is indeed a controversial curiosity. It ought really to be embalmed for the delectation of future ages as a masterpiece of ingenious sophistry. The territorial army, it seems, is not there to defeat the invader. For that purpose is it might not be safe to rely upon it, at any rate until it has had 6 months training after the outbreak of war, which the would-be invader cannot be absolutely trusted to give it time for. It is there to frighten the invader into coming if he comes at all, with a force of such magnitude that the Navy is bound to see him and catch him. But are we, in all seriousness, prepared to stake our national existence upon the soundness of a theory such as this? Substantially, it is only a rather comical variation of the old argument with which we started, the all-sufficiency of the Navy. Look at it how you will, the apologists of our present system are always driven back to this position, that we must be supreme at sea, and that if we lost, even temporarily, the complete command of the sea, our case would be hopeless. That doctrine is, I venture to think, a dangerously exaggerated one, exaggerated in both directions. It is exaggerated in its optimism. I mean in the assumption that the absolute command of the sea is something which we can, by willing it, by doubling and redoubling our expenditure on ships and armaments, under all circumstances ensure, and it is exaggerated in its pessimism, that is to say, in its craven teaching that if we lost even partially, even temporarily, the command of the sea, we must immediately collapse. That may be our case today. I'm afraid it is something like our case. But if it is, it affords the strongest possible combination of our present system. Let us indeed, by all means, seek to maintain command of the sea. That must always be our main object. Let us seek, among other things, by ensuring that our fleets, that mobility and striking power, which cannot be gravely impaired by constant anxiety about our inadequately defended base. But do not let us for one moment admit that if our power at sea were crippled, everything would be at an end, and we should just have to throw up our hands in despair. It is against that idea, and against acquiescence in a policy which is based on that idea, that the National Service League emphatically protests. And if you come to think of it, is there not something crude and unreal in this talk about command of the sea, as if it were necessarily absolute one way or the other? Well, when you're a thalassocracy, you drive your power from the sea, from having an overseas empire. So yes, the Navy is absolutely vital and essential. I mean, look at Venice, or look at, there's something like the Spanish Empire. In those circumstances, the Navy is of critical importance to maintain the security of that empire. If you have it, all is well. If you have not got it, all is over. And how many wars has it not for a long time hung in the balance? There can be no absolute command of the sea in war unless, as at Trafalgar or at Tsushima, the enemy's fleet is wholly annihilated. No absolute loss of it unless your own fleet is similarly crushed. And no doubt, if the British fleet was absolutely crushed, no land force could save us, for then indeed we might be starved out and invasion would be superfluous. But such a disaster is improbable under present circumstances, even impossible. What is likewise, I hope, improbable, but surely not impossible, having regard to naval forces that might at no distant future be brought against us, is that the British fleet should be unable at every stage of the conflict to afford us that absolute protection on which we rely. After all, in the great struggle of 100 years ago, it needed nothing less than Trafalgar to give us that complete protection. But assuming for one moment, and one does not like even to contemplate these terrible contingencies, but it is not sensible or manly to shut our eyes to them, assuming, I say, that we met with a reverse at sea, perhaps only a partial, only a temporary reverse, which uncovered a portion of our coasts, would not, under present circumstances, invasion and invasion in great force almost certainly follow. It would be infinitely easier to effect today than it has ever been in the past, and no sane man can think without a shudder of what invasion in force under present circumstances would inevitably mean. A whole blow is struck at the heart, the dislocation of our whole national life, perhaps the capture of one or more of our naval bases, of the workshops supplying our material of war. These would convert a check at sea, from which, if unassailable on land, we might well recover into an all-round and irretrievable disaster. Our power of recuperation would be gone. That, to my mind, is a far more real danger than the bugbear of starvation, even if we were to continue as we need not continue, or not to continue, and as I hope, will not continue to be as largely dependent as we are now on imported food. Well, you're right on that, Lord Milner. We were, and still are very dependent on imported food, and which was the bloody consequence of the Corn Laws. And if only we'd implemented tariffs and helped rebuilding British agriculture. Got a comment from Iron Duke. Milner showing his German side in this. Yeah, that is a very interesting angle, Iron Duke. I don't think we can certainly disagree with that. But that is a different topic which I cannot develop tonight. I'll take things as they are, and I maintain that as they are, you would have vessels from every part of the world vying with one another to pour supplies into the British market, and it would be no such easy matter to seal up all our ports, as long as the British fleet, even if it had failed to keep complete command of the sea, was still formidable, was still, to use the technical term, a fleet in being. The hostile fleet which, in that case, would still be threatened, could not possibly afford to attach all the ships necessary to maintain such a blockade. Any disturbance of our food supplies would no doubt be a very grave matter. It would mean a great rise in prices and immense hardship, but such disturbance as distinct from complete interruption would not spell ruin. An invading army of 200,000 or 300,000 would almost certainly would. Is it reasonable to leave the door wide open to such a possibility? Even if the risk were less serious than it is, why should we run it at all? What else this nation that, with more to lose perhaps than any other, with a stronger natural position to start with than any other, it is content to stop so far short of what other nations do for self-protection? Well, what's that expression? Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Like if we have great geography, we're being an island that we don't need as big a military as other continental powers, then our present system is fine. Let the continentals worry about having mass conscript armies to defend their multiple frontiers. Think of the French and Germans with their 2.5 years military service and their armies of 3 or 4 million fully trained men. And here we are pottering over the training of 200,000 or 300,000 men for 15 days a year, and no one knows how long we shall even get that number. We are content to leave it to chance. With the enormous advantage of our geographical position, we might be absolutely secure, safer within our sea-girt borders than any nation with a great open land frontier can ever be, no matter what the extent of its military preparations. Yes, far safer and with far less effort, but not with so little effort as we actually make. To leave the bulk of the manhood of this country without military training at all, to rely solely upon the navy, is not to use the immense advantage of our insular position, but to abuse it, to presume upon it. It is not fair to the navy that splendid service of which we are all proud, which will, no doubt, do in the future, as in the past, all that can reasonably be expected of it. And it would not be fair in the case of a general European struggle to our allies, or rather, let me say, it is not calculated to make our alliance as valuable or as desirable as it ought to be. I dare say a critic might say to me, what do you mean by talking of the inadequacy of our efforts? Do we not always spend enormous sums upon national defence? And are not statesmen of all parties at present agreed in contemplating the expenditure of even greater sums? Yes, but here we come to the fundamental point of difference between the view of the National Service League and the once generally accepted view of national defence. We simply do not believe that you can buy national safety by any expenditure of mere money, however vast. Everything is comparative in these matters. No doubt our expenditure on defence is very great and very onerous, but so is the expenditure of other nations. It is idle to think that we can keep pace with them by the power of mere money when they are prepared to spend not only their money but themselves. What I want to put to you is this question. Would it really hurt us if we were to do as they do and rely on our ultimate security upon the personal service of our whole able-bodied manhood, irrespective of class? The question of the degree and the nature of the training which every able-bodied young man would have to undergo, is not one that I can go into now. It is not perhaps at any time a question to be decided by civilians, but rather by military experts. But the broad principle involved, you and I can judge as well as any soldier. I say, would it hurt us to do as great rivals do? Has it hurt them? I believe I'm not singular. I believe I'm not asserting what 9 out of every 10 experienced travellers will confirm when I say that the great military nations of the continent have not suffered, but have benefited physically, morally, socially, from the training of their whole young manhood in military exercises and military discipline. War is an evil and a tremendous evil, but military training is not. It is a positive benefit to most nations. To none that I can imagine would it be a greater benefit than to a nation which suffers so much as ours does today from the congestion of its peoples in great cities. Neither does military training, provided it is general, make for war. On the contrary, it is just the opposite effect. There have been far fewer wars in Europe since nations in arms have been substituted for professional armies. A professional army cannot be expected to have the same aversion for war which a national army, consisting as it does mainly of men who have other pursuits and wish nothing less than to see them interrupted inevitably and invariably displays. Right, and that is the end of the final essay I wanted to read tonight. And yes, you can see that throughout the decade preceding World War One, Milner just kept hammering and hammering this issue of national service over and over and over again. And as I said earlier, he does eventually get his way in the war when in 1916 they do finally implement the national service he is so fanatic about. And so in terms of shillings, so as I said earlier in the stream, I have released channel memberships now. So if you want to support me, there's 3 tiers. There's Fella tier for 99p, where you get a badge for joining, and I may add some emojis for people to use in the chat. Also, you get access to member only polls, which I'll use if I get enough members, or maybe at least 10 or something. You've then got Orientis tier, which is $2.99. You get the same as a Fella tier, but you also get access to paywalled videos. And then finally, you've got Pasha tier for $4.99 a month. You get you get in the previous 2 tiers, but you also get paywalled live streams. So please join the channel if you want to support me or access to that content. All the paywalls will be going live on Saturday. So this is the next few days is your last opportunity to watch anything before it goes behind the paywall. But just to reiterate, Archival Discourses is staying free for the foreseeable future, and I don't think I will ever put it behind the paywall, to be honest. But the Chatham House version series is going to go behind the paywall, except for the first episode, and a few other streams I've put up on the channel, and a couple of videos that I have done. In terms of other streams, obviously I'll be back next Tuesday for the next episodes of Archival Discourses. I mean, This Nation, Then the Empire, series of speeches by Milner. There's so many different topics he touches on. I might be tempted to do like another topic, like maybe like imperial preference or tariffs or something. But also on the 15th of February, which is this Saturday from this one, I'm going to be having Charlemagne return onto the channel. We're going to be discussing the book Rich Relations, The American Occupation of Britain, 1942 to 45. He has already released a Substack article, which you want, if people want to, can go and read. I believe it's a paywall article on his Substack, so you do have to be a paying member in order to read that. But regardless, we will be discussing that book in further on the 15th. So if you're interested in that topic about the American military presence and its impact on Britain during World War II, please give that stream a watch. But just making sure we've not had any super chats. Okay. No, not had any super chats. Okay. Well, anywho, thank you everybody for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Good night.